I forgot, I moved these two slides into our presentation because I'd forgotten to put them in there. They came from an old place, and so while we were watching the discussion about the orders, right? I decided, hey, I better put these things back in here. So, as part of our prior discussion on the influences on the proper Greek culture, the classical Greek culture, one last thing that's really, really important to note is Egypt. Okay? Why? Anybody want to take a guess? First of all, let me ask a question. Would you believe it if I said that there were Greek tourists that went to Egypt? You're laughing. Guess what? There were Greek tourists that went to Egypt.
How do you know?
Because they wrote about it. There were Greek philosophers that went to the ruins of some of the ruins that were along the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. The Greeks moved around a lot. They studied a lot. And yes, they were visiting Egypt. Okay? Part of what is really important to note is that I showed you that slide last week, right, where all of these cultures were pretty much running at the same time. The Greeks came at it late compared to Mesopotamia and Egypt, but they were all running at the same time, and eventually they were all conquered by the same people, those nasty little Roman people, right? But think about it. I forgot where this quote comes from. I'm gonna just go out on a limb and say maybe it was Sir Bannister Fletcher, but I'm not positive. The very notion that temples ought to be built of stone and that they required large numbers of columns must have come from Egypt. Remember, Greeks were tourists in Egypt at this time. Okay, the Greeks must have also acquired much of their stone cutting and masonry technique from the Egyptians, along with the idea of architectural ornamentation, okay, and the knowledge of geometry they needed to lay out their temples and put the parts together. Part of why I keep going back to this whole idea, right, of understanding geography and the relationships of what was going on is so that you guys don't walk away from my class the way that I walked away from my history classes, which was everything was this little capsule, and it all happened kind of independent one thing of the other. There was a huge amount, right, of communication existing between these cultures. So imagine, I mean, who would think of building, would you guys honestly think of building a building out of marble?
No.
No. I mean, you build stuff out of wood, or if you're going to build it out of stone, you pile stones together. You don't go find a gigantic chunk of marble and sculpt it into a piece of a column. Right? But yet, that's what the Egyptians did. So I just want to bring that to your attention. One of the things that is different, I got to get this to click. There it goes. One of the things that's different, that is a distinct difference between the Egyptian temples and the Greek temples, is that they're kind of inverted, right? In plan, the Greek temple is looking to be experienced from the outside, whereas the Egyptian temples had this very single frontal axis, right? Notice that a lot of the pictures and stuff that we showed you when looking at the Egyptian architecture were frontal when approaching the pylon, right? There were very, very little sort of views from the sides. Whereas the Greek temples, they're very different. They're designed to be three-dimensional and viewed from all around. I'll try to find some information, but one of the things that you'll find is that the Greek temples, when you look at them, they look like somebody just sort of rolled dice and threw them out on the landscape. They're not set on these exact axes and stuff, right? Well, I'll show you examples. And part of a Greek theorist's viewpoint on that, I can't remember the guy's name. I'll find the name, was that they were intended to be viewed, they were placed very purposely at all these weird angles so that they could be viewed from different positions as a three-dimensional object rather than as a two-dimensional object that you approach, like the pylon, like the Egyptian pylon. So up above here, we have something that you guys have already seen, the Egyptian pylon, right? And then we have a typical Greek temple below. The term basilica, right, is a misnomer. All right, the basilica, it was later attributed to, I believe, the Romans. Okay, but anyway, so you take a look at this, and you could see where you could approach this thing from the front, and you would get sort of one view of it, right? But if you looked at it from the corner, you would get a different view of the thing, and it wouldn't be like looking at the side back walls like you're looking at over in here. Okay? All right. So we just had this brief introduction to the Greek orders that we went into the other room and saw. And you guys got an idea with my paraphrasing of the fact that the Greeks considered the human body to be one of the key things of beauty. They also considered mathematics to be a symbol, or not a symbol, but a key thing of beauty. And they, within the human body, found a whole series of mathematical relationships. Are you raising your hand, or are you just scratching your head? Okay. All right. So let's keep going. All right. So we talked about the influences, Mycenae, Greek vernacular building in Egypt. These are specifically now to the Doric order. Remember, the Doric order is probably an earlier order than the Ionic by just not too much time. I don't know, maybe 100 years. All right. It's also geographic. And so that's something that I want you guys to kind of be aware of. Let me back up for just a moment here to here. Okay? So I'm going to use my little mousy thing to kind of show. So the Doric order came from the main part of Greece, which is over in here. Okay? And remember, you guys are supposed to be memorizing kind of the shape of the Mediterranean, where the Black Sea is, where the Caspian Sea is, where the Persian Gulf is, all of that. So this part was sort of Greece proper, but Greece also existed where modern-day Turkey is. And the Ionians lived in this region, and that is where the Ionic columns came from initially. As the Greek culture sort of grew and developed, right, they started to experience each other's things, and they eventually sort of adopted the styles back and forth and used them for different purposes, okay? There was one more city, I think it's somewhere in this area, which is where the Corinthian column came from, all right? And one last thing that I want you guys to understand, and it was sort of briefly discussed in that thing. The orders are not just a type of column. That is a mistake that people often make. The orders were a proportioning system that organized the column to the stylobate, which is the base, to the entablature, which ran above. Okay? So that relationship of proportions were all sort of linked together. All right. There's a quote right there by a gentleman named Jansen, and it talks about the fact that from the earliest Doric temples through the latest Doric temples, it's like they almost just appeared, right? There wasn't this development that we see in other places. Now, granted, one of the things that you got to kind of take into consideration is that it took place over a relatively shorter period of time, right? Compared to, say, the Egyptians that were out doing their thing for over 3,000 years. So one of the examples that is often cited is the Temple of Artemis at Corfu. All right, and it dates back to about 600 BCE, and it shows pretty much all of those characteristics of the Doric order that remained in effect throughout the entire classical Greek period. Here is an example of that, the Temple of Artemis, and you can see the columns with the entasis. You can see that they don't have a base. They're sitting on the stylobate, which is the steps, okay, of that. You can see the capitals, the triglyphs, the metopes, and you can see the pediment with the two lions sort of up at the top with, I think, the goddess or the god at the center. All right. One of the other influences of the Doric order that we want to kind of highlight is this idea that they originally built in wood, right? And that when they started to make these stone temples that would eventually endure for thousands of years, right? That they were in some ways mimicking what they did with the wood temples, with the wood structures, which didn't exist for long periods of time. So here you kind of see a sort of Greek vernacular showing wood frame construction with bricks in the walls, right? The columns, and then wood beams and what would be on the face of the beams, right? And then you sort of start to link that up with the idea of a column and this trabeated construction that is a post and lintel, right? And then the remnants of these sorts of beams, right, up on the face. At this point, they're just decoration. They're just ornamentation, all right? But they're part of this very rigorous sort of system of outlining a temple. A system so rigorous that you can look at Doric temples all across a wide region over a span of 500 years, and there's a consistency that continues to exist throughout that time period. Okay? We sort of already talked about Egypt and particularly to use the word that the lady used last week, Djoser's sort of funerary complex. And you can see that they've got the fluting of the columns, right? Remember we talked about those columns a couple weeks ago? And how those columns were the first major colonnaded thing that came about as part of Egypt. And so we start to see how that can influence, how that's had an influence on the origins of the Doric order. Look at the fluting on those columns, on the Egyptian ones, right? So there is this thing, these sort of flutes. There was theories that maybe it was like a bundled reed of papyrus or something, right? And then I want you guys to note that those are convex. That means they're sticking out, right? Whereas the flutes on the Doric column are carved in. They're convex, right? I can sketch that for you on the board if you want. So one of them is a series of little puffy things like that, and the other one is a series of carved out pieces like that. Which is which again? This is Greek. That was from the Temple of Djoser. Djoser, as that lady says. So, with that heavy accent. Okay. We already, in that thing, we talked about the parts of the Doric order. Okay. And so here we see kind of a little bit more of a diagram. Uh-oh, I'm out of time, huh? Did I go past 15?
No, you're at 14.
I'm at 14. All right. I better stop because we got to talk about this one for a little while. So.